This here is ElRichMC, and in August 2022, he became the first player to obtain Bedrock in survival single player. And not just Bedrock, but all the forbidden blocks, such as command blocks or barrier blocks, thus proving that this technique could be done in a single player game.
For me, I'll always say that this is the peak of technical Minecraft. A number of coincidences that happened at a single moment in a specific version to achieve something unimaginable.
What ElRichMC did was turn a falling sand block into a falling bedrock block. And that way, when that block was broken, it would give you the bedrock item.
This took so long that at first it was all theoretical videos. There was no practice, the only time I've really felt like I was studying Minecraft.
A lot of questions must come up here, right? Why does a falling bedrock block exist? Doesn't that only happen with sand or gravel? How did he get the other forbidden blocks, like the end portal? But most importantly, what does Mojang think? Sit back, because I'll answer these questions and more. This milestone is the greatest achievement in technical Minecraft, marking the most ambitious, complex, and large-scale project in its history. In my opinion, this is the pinnacle of technical Minecraft research. But obviously, something like this can't be achieved overnight. Done? Not even in several years. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to 2013. The player and now Mojang employee, Panda4994, along with Daniel Coates and Cabo PC, uploaded a video in 2013 in which they were able for the first time to modify terrain population in Minecraft as they wished. And what do I mean by this? Look, the concept is very simple, but doing it isn't nearly as simple. As you know, when you walk around in Minecraft, you generate new chunks. Obviously, all of Minecraft isn't generated when you start the world. A chunk is a 16 by 16 portion of the Minecraft world. So when a 16 by 16 portion is generated first, it creates the terrain. And after that, another function kicks in, called population. The population of the chunk is what determines if trees appear, if temples appear, some grass too, basically populating the chunk. I mean, without populating it, it's simply dirt and stone. So Panda, together with Daniel and Cabo, started experimenting with this concept. In what way? Well, they thought that if you somehow brought blocks to a chunk that hadn't been populated yet, you could make the population behave in unexpected ways. Because the population is programmed, assuming that chunks are a certain way. When the code was written, nobody thought that someone could modify them before you populated them. Through a lot of calculations and analysis of the game's code, they managed to find a way to generate spawners for, well, skeletons and more mobs. But in this video, what he showed was that with a machine he called the Cobra, which, by the way, doing this in 2013 when there were no slimes, is pretty impressive. You see here what he did was push a kind of cobblestone room whose blocks are very precisely placed to a spot in midair in a chunk that hadn't been populated yet. You can't place these blocks manually since that loads and populates the chunk, which defeats the purpose. You need a machine to move them. And in his video, he shows how he moves 4 of these rooms in the air, and then when the chunk gets populated because of the game code, it interprets that it has to place skeleton spawners in those areas. And that's how he manages to be the first person to trick Minecraft's population code at will. In fact, his reaction says it all. Is there a spawner there?
What? Yes! Yes!
But anyway, this was one of the most important breakthroughs, and we're going to jump ahead 6 years to see the next relevant milestone. Obviously, the people who were discovering this didn't know that it would later be used to get Bedrock. The two main goals that the community set for itself, depending on who you ask, obviously, were to get Bedrock and to get an end portal frame. As you know, you can make a nether portal anywhere, but those portals only exist where they generate. Having the end portal frame obviously was also a big goal, because at any moment you could set up a portal to the end and teleport back to your respawn point, or have a storage in the end and access it, or simply put a portal in your base and that's it. But anyway, Bedrock was the biggest goal the community had, because it's not just an exclusive and cool item to get, but it's also something practical. At that time, wither cages were used a lot, where you would use a wither trapped in bedrock to break wood from wood farms, or cobblestone from cobblestone farms. And by being able to have bedrock in your inventory, you could set up those cages anywhere without any problem. That's why several players in the community started experimenting. And one of the most remarkable attempts was this one. You can find it in videos by XCOM, X-Sample, where, as you can see by pushing a block that doesn't exist with slime and then turning it into obsidian, the game gets confused and gives you the obsidian item. So XCOM thought it was a good idea to go down that path because, of course, if that happens with obsidian, why couldn't it happen with Bedrock? Obviously, getting Bedrock to generate at a specific point is something very difficult, but they had a great idea. And it was based on something that Panda managed again in his experiments. Well, because Panda had made what he called an end crystal generator, which once again tricked the game using population to generate the end pillars with an end crystal on top, because back then you couldn't craft them. The interesting thing about this is that when those towers are generated, the end crystal appears on top of a bedrock block. Well, actually, it still appears on top of a bedrock block today. But that was a way to generate a bedrock block in an already existing world. So that's where the theory started, right? If you manage to do what I just showed you here with an obsidian block, but you manage to get a bedrock block to appear at that spot because you've timed the population so it happens at that exact moment, then you could get the bedrock item. And this was the first big step toward getting the item. A lot of people had dreamed of just having an idea or a path to follow that didn't require going back to the beta versions to get Bedrock. This is really the point where the race to get the Bedrock item begins. But the game wasn't going to make it that easy. Even though the theory was true, they realized something pretty bad. And it was only going to work 1 out of every 3,000 times you tried it. Because of some things with the game's RNG, the randomness of the game, you could only get it 1 out of every 3,000 times. And obviously, setting up something like this so that situation happens, and the effort it takes to do it just once. Imagine, 3,000 times is impossible. You'd spend your whole life on it. Even today, in 2026, I'd still be doing it. But here, since there were a lot of people working on this, they came up with a great idea. And if the game's randomness doesn't let this happen, then you just change the game's randomness. This has already been done. If you've watched technical server tours on my channel, you've seen how they change the RNG, or game's randomness, so that, for example, mining diamonds always gives you 4 diamonds, or the maximum resistance, which I believe is 32. But anyway, at that time they had a problem, and it was that the RNG modification could only be done in 1.9 because it used something from the M-Cities. And what's the problem with this? That this technique they were trying only worked in 1.8. And here we have to take a small step back to understand it. A player in 2015, in a snapshot called 15W51B, he discovered that if you made the Ender Dragon respawn with an Ender Crystal on top of the spawn platform and interrupted the animation before it finished, that Ender Crystal would break the bedrock block underneath it and drop it as an item. This bug was uploaded to Mojang's bug tracker. I don't know if you know about it. Honestly, it's very interesting. You can look up all the bugs that are fixed, unfixed, or pending. So then Jeb responded to this bug by saying that what he did was, since he can't investigate all the ways to obtain bedrock, he simply made it so that if you somehow managed to break the bedrock block, it wouldn't drop the item. He simply removed this, and this became a turning point because it made it practically impossible to obtain the bedrock block. How are you supposed to get the bedrock block if the block itself doesn't give it to you when you break it? Honestly, Jeb made it impossible here, and the community was divided. There were those who believed they had to try to get it in 1.8, and the more optimistic ones who thought it could still be done from 1.9 onwards, even in the versions everyone was playing at that time, like 1.12. This is when the community fell into depression. Over 3 years trying to get the bedrock block in survival, and the main obstacle is just programming it so the block can't drop. Obviously, this made things very, very difficult. After having found a way to get bedrock, it seems like Mojang was putting up every possible obstacle to keep this from happening. It was no longer a fight against code techniques, but rather a fight against the developers themselves. Jeb was putting up a big barrier. The people who were researching this felt like it was useless now, because this technique could only be done in an old version. Some people even gave up on the idea because most servers were already on 1.12, and they hoped to maybe find something in 1.12, but there was no path to follow. And in this division of players, those who wanted to try it in 1.8 and those who wanted to try it in 1.12 versions later, with Mojang's restriction on dropping the Bedrock item. It seems like the 1.8 players won the race, because Matthew Boland managed to create a method to modify the RNG in this version. In 1.8, he teamed up with XCOM, and on his server they used this slime technique and got the Bedrock item for the first time. After this, years went by. The research seemed to be stalled. There were even players who thought it was impossible to get Bedrock. They said it was nice to find it in 1.8, but it just wasn't possible to go any further. There were some theories, some speculations, but no one could figure it out. In fact, there wasn't even a real direction to take, an idea to investigate. They were just vague ideas about how to get Bedrock. Everyone wanted it, but no one knew how to do it. But it wasn't until 2020 that all of this changed completely. The pandemic probably helped a lot. There was a player who was determined to find a way to get Bedrock, this time from the game's own code. This player is known as Earth Computer, and he is one of the most important figures in the research on how to obtain Bedrock and consequently all the unobtainable blocks. Well, Earth Computer started to investigate and came to several conclusions. Bedrock is unbreakable, as we already know, and if you somehow manage to break it, it doesn't give you the item. But he tested by lowering the durability of Bedrock in the game's code, and as you can see, if you break it with a Silk Touch pickaxe, it does give you the item. And finally, he discovered that there was, I don't know if I should call it a bug or a place where they could get into the code of the falling sand. As you know, in the game, sand falls if there's no block beneath it. Like with the piston, it's not the same block. The solid sand block is a normal block, but when it starts to fall, it becomes an entity called falling sand, and then when it touches the ground, it turns back into sand again. Well, Earth Computer, while investigating the Minecraft code very thoroughly, found something in the code during this transformation from sand to entity that he's going to show you here. Don't be scared. This is a very simple pseudocode and a complete simplification of the actual code in the game. I'll explain it to you quickly, okay? The first line of code is the block variable, which is the variable you'll use to know which block it is. It simply gets it from the world, right? So, in the first line of the code, let's say you have a sand block and you get the ID of the sand, which used to be a number, a name, sand, whatever. So the code knows that this block is sand. And then it goes into an if statement, right? A condition. If that block is sand, the next part of the code is executed. What you see as ellipses are several things in the code that aren't relevant right now, but other things happen in the code. Well, among those operations, if the block is sand, one of them is, again, to get the world ID. The block variable is retrieved again. And after that, there's another part of the code that creates a falling block entity, which in this case, the game assumes is sand, of course. But here's where the bug comes in, right? Between the first part of the code, where you pick up the block, and the second part of the code where you pick up the block, if you somehow make that coordinate where the sand starts change to Bedrock, the code, when it gets to the fourth line you're seeing here, which is to create a falling entity from the block variable, that block variable, since it's been picked up again, will be Bedrock. It creates a falling Bedrock entity for you. Earth Computer discovered this and began investigating. Of course, obviously you should know that everything I'm showing you here happens in thousandths of a second. Or it's very difficult. You can't do it by hand, not even with population or anything. It's not possible. He started to investigate those ellipses that I'm showing you here. Maybe there's a way you can trick the code so that the block changes. He started looking, they did tests and everything, and they saw that there was nothing that could be done to trick the game into changing that block in that part of the code to Bedrock or another item. What Earth Computer didn't realize was that he was setting the stage to eventually obtain all the forbidden blocks in the game. But that's for later. In his video, Earth Computer explains that he simply abandoned this idea because he couldn't get anything out of it. But he says something, and listen carefully.
There's an idea about multi-threading. I'm 99.9999% sure it's not going to work, so don't even bring it up.
You can use multi-threading, meaning multiple threads within the game, to insert the change with another thread. But as you heard, he says there's a 99.9999% chance that's not going to work. So after this, Earth Computer keeps investigating inside the game's code and finds this same sand error. He finds it in a very specific type of action. He finds this error in blocks whose state can be changed by using right-click. And another thing I haven't mentioned, it has to be instaminable, of course. So when those blocks are mined, there's this double variable check. Therefore, you can do the same thing of inserting a bedrock block somehow. Well, he starts investigating and discovers that there are 3 blocks with this condition where their state changes with right-click. These are the note block. When you right-click it, its pitch changes. The redstone ore, which as you know lights up. It's a very small light, but it does light up. And the dragon egg, which teleports when you click it. So what happens? So from here, it needs to be an instaminable block. Then he starts testing. The dragon egg takes a long time to mine and is very difficult. You can't instamine it. The redstone ore, if you use efficiency 5 and haste 2, you do break it pretty fast, but you don't instamine it. On the other hand, the note block with an efficiency 5 axe and haste 2, you can instamine it.
This got us really excited to start.
And it probably gives them the first hope of getting bedrock since Jeb made that change. Because as he had discovered, with Silk Touch you could mine bedrock. So what was their mission? Their mission was, with chunk population, and here we go back a bit to the beginning, to what was explained at the start. Placing a note block in a place where bedrock hasn't generated yet. Going there, mining the block, and after mining the block, bedrock gets generated. Therefore, the game is going to interrupt. It will interpret that you have broken, because of this double check I mentioned, the block that was just generated there, which is bedrock. This made them very happy, and they started trying to do it. The truth is that they ran into several problems, but the biggest one is that a Silk Touch axe doesn't work on stone. What do I mean by this? Bedrock belongs to the stone family in Minecraft, and stone only drops itself as a block if you mine it with Silk Touch, but it has to be a pickaxe. Because if it's an axe, it doesn't drop the item. Therefore, this idea is completely ruled out. And the last thing left is the redstone lore, but the redstone lore can't be instant mined. So here, Earth Computer pauses the investigation a bit. He's found a lot of things. He's gotten pretty close. And he throws it to the community and says, hey, if you get an efficiency 8 pickaxe, we've got bedrock. Really, if you get an efficiency 8 pickaxe somehow, which nobody knows how, then we'll have bedrock. It's a big breakthrough, but it stays pretty much stuck there. What Earth Computer didn't know is that he had planted the seed of multi-threading, of multiple threads and of sand. Well, 2 weeks after this discovery, the truth is that nobody found a way to get an efficiency 8 pickaxe. And to this day, it's impossible. But Earth Computer did discover something very important. He found that same code error somewhere else. And it's simply that if you have fire in front of a block you're going to mine, that double block check happens again. Therefore, you no longer need it to be an out block, a redstone ore, or a dragon egg. If you put fire in front, it can be any block. So he quickly started testing it. And he built this setup that's very famous. You might have seen it before. And it was the first big step to get bedrock. You have to go to the end, to an area where you know an end gateway is going to generate. One of those portals that takes you back to the main island. So before it generates, you manage to place a slime block there, and then you put fire in front. The first thing Computer did was lag the game a lot, throw an ender pearl to land very close to that slime block, and run towards the slime block, and since the game was still lagging, it doesn't populate the chunk and the end gateway hasn't appeared. So he uses this moment to break the slime block through the fire, which is crucial. He uses a Silk Touch pickaxe. So the game is processing the lag it has. And after processing the lag, it remembers and says, oh, I have to populate this chunk because it doesn't exist yet. And then it populates it, and that generates an end gateway. And after generating all this, bedrock, remember that this player has mined that block, and since it checks which block it is, it thinks that the player just broke bedrock and drops it for them. And that's how, for the first time since Jeb made that change, someone manages to break a bedrock block. This big step was no longer just a victory against the game, it was a victory against the game's developers, who were trying to prevent any way of getting bedrock. And even with their techniques, they couldn't stop these players from finding a way to get a bedrock block. It was a double victory. You just have to see their reaction.
Oh my god!
Yo? Yo. Many players from the community started making their own setups. Even this crazy guy here speedran it in 44 minutes. He started a game and in 44 minutes, he got the bedrock block. Though this achievement was impressive, it wasn't what the community wanted. Much work remained. This setup you see here only gets you one bedrock, and you have to repeat it several times and resort to illegal methods and duplicate your bedrock item to get many of those items. I talked to ElRichMC to ask him why he didn't use this method in his survival game, and he told me it wasn't enough. He wanted to be able to have several bedrock blocks. Why? What good is just one bedrock? Well, it can be useful for decorating your house and saying, hey, I got this item. But its real uses don't come into play unless you have several stacks or at least several of that item. In short, it's a very important discovery, but it's not enough to become a project for the world of the Rift. But it wasn't until 2020 that the best minds in technical Minecraft came together to attempt what has been, to this day, the biggest and most ambitious project in Minecraft history. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this. I truly believe it. ElRichMC also strongly believes this is true.
For me, I'll always say that this is the peak of technical Minecraft. It's an amount of reverse engineering that's been done to the code, a number of coincidences that have come together at a single moment in a specific version to achieve something unimaginable. So many people involved. I mean, there are so many concepts and discoveries from a lot of talented people. For me, it's the peak. It's the most incredible point the technical Minecraft community has ever reached.
The project was to manipulate the threads so that in that part of the code, there would be time between one line executing and the next. For those of you who have programmed, you know that's a very short amount of time. But you can even slow down the game and through another thread, manage to make that change from one block to another block. And theoretically, if you're able to manipulate the game so that the thread code behaves the way you want, you could theoretically make it change to any block, but that's just in theory. And let me clarify a bit in case you don't know what threads are. Well, in games or in any kind of programming, there can be threads which are nothing more than lines of execution. The typical example is in thread 1, A, B, and C are executed, and at the same time in thread 2, D, E, and F are executed. This means that the actual order of execution could be A, B, then D, E, F, and then C. It depends, because they're basically two programs running asynchronously. Minecraft has its main thread, where most of the important things happen, but like other games, sometimes it can have a thread, for example, for lighting. It's done for many reasons, to avoid overloading the main thread for basic task division, or to prevent a lagging thread from crashing the main thread. So many reasons, right? All right, so this group of experts, their first mission was to look for a thread they could use, apart from Minecraft's main thread, where they could somehow create new blocks or change block states. Well, through a profiler and a lot of testing, they managed to find a thread that did exactly what they wanted. This is a strange thread, as the programming could have been done differently. But that's not the point. In Minecraft, there was a thread dedicated to changing beacon colors when stained glass was placed on them. So there was a thread dedicated exclusively to that. And they discovered that this thread accessed the loading and population of chunks. It accessed certain functions they needed in the code to be able to modify them at will. By the way, this group of experts decided to call this the Threadstone. For those who don't know, within the Threadstone, there are, let's say, certain areas that can be the slime stone, the build stone, and well, most of them usually have that name, with stone at the end. Threadstone is kind of like the redstone of threads. It isn't actually related to redstone, though. That's what they called this method. And nowadays, for example, there's a Discord where they have everything that's been discovered about Threadstone documented. Their discoveries help with other things and could be useful for more than just getting bedrock in the future. As I mentioned, when they began looking into Threadstone, it was just a theory. Some thought they were crazy for investigating this, or believed they wouldn't get far, or might find something, but not anything significant. And when it seemed like they were just going around in circles with the code, without much result other than something theoretical, Coolman24 uploaded this video to the internet called It Works, and in it, we can see someone performing the first falling block swap in the history of Minecraft. Only, well, it ends up quite far from the bedrock. What he manages to do is swap concrete powder for a concrete block while the block is falling. He obviously did this in creative mode. He didn't show it in survival or anything like that, but it already gave us an idea that it was starting to become possible. And that thing we had heard about being a 99.9999% sure that it's not going to work was starting to get closer to 80, 70%. It seemed like it was getting a little bit closer. From here, they began using this beacon thread. And if you manage to populate a chunk and with an observer you detect that it has been populated, in this case it's done with water, when you see that something has been changed to water, an observer detects it. And a line of observers starts, a line of redstone of updates, and that line. The very important thing is that this line has been activated through the beacon thread. That is, you have a line of updates with observers that you can also make circular. And these observers run asynchronously to the main thread. If you haven't understood, imagine that you catch that thread and make it into an update clock and let it keep spinning. Well, that's the line of asynchronous observers. So, to sum up, and so we understand each other, with this line, what you can do is send updates to a sand block that's just starting to fall and force that part of the code that does the double checking. I've said it this simply so I don't make the video too long because this can get crazy. I could be here talking like Rich did. But let's just say that getting that line of asynchronous observers is something very complex. In short, you need to reverse engineer the code and manage complex interactions to achieve that line of asynchronous observers. In ElRichMC's video, you can see this creates many inconsistencies in the game. And in fact, one of the most interesting things to see in this case were the invisible chunks, which are nothing more than chunks that haven't been populated yet, but have already been generated. In Rich's video, you can see how he interacts with this chunk. If you go inside the chunk, it's like you disappear, but you can still move. The blocks are there, but you can't see them. Entities can pass through. Even a flying machine can get through. You just don't see it. The behavior is strange. Clearly, Minecraft wasn't built for this, and no one expected anyone to reach this point. However, it wasn't until February 2022 that this started to yield serious results, but that didn't mean the journey was already over. There was still another giant step left, and we can see that giant step in the setup that ElRichMC made. As you can see, he used a line of asynchronous observers that are constantly updating a falling sand block, which allows the part of the code where you want to swap that sand block for a bedrock one to stay active all the time. But it wasn't as simple as just that. Once you have the falling sand block being updated, how do you manage to insert the bedrock block into the game's code? To be honest, you can't. With everything I've told you so far and with everything we know up to now, it's impossible. There's no way. I mean, you need the game to somehow populate bedrock. It doesn't do that since bedrock on the bottom layer is generated during the chunk generation phase, not the population phase. And the only place where there's decoration or population of bedrock is in the end, with the end gateways, with the end towers, and so on. However, in the end, you can't recreate this setup since chunks don't generate with water. So the asynchronous observer line isn't possible. So things start to get pretty complicated, and this is where the magic solution comes in the form of a bug comes in, some of the biggest abuses I've seen of the game's code. It's a bomb inside Mojang. I mean, poking the developers in the eye is a crazy thing. And it's called Wordtearing. This technique, which I've also explained a bit before, basically lets two threads interact with the same chunk. So you can have one write one block and the other write another. In simple terms, by doing those two writes, with a little bit of magic, you make one of the bits of one of the blocks you've placed change. And of course, obviously each block in the game's code, in the underlying code, has its own line of bits that represents it. If you change a bit, just one, you've completely changed the block. So in this way, if we combine Wordtearing, asynchronous observers, falling blocks, multiple threads with chunk changes, and 1,000 other things that have been done, well, you get this setup where there's a small chance that the sand block gets changed to a falling bedrock block. And why do I say a small chance? Because you're using threads, and with some observers constantly sending pulses of continuous updates, let's say you can hammer away at the spots you want to search, right? But making both threads line up and do what you want at the exact moment is something very unlikely. But in this setup, it's done by brute force. It's been tried often, and maybe only 5 or 10% of the time it works. Rich struggled with this a lot. As I said, you have to do it by brute force. This can happen randomly, but randomness can be forced. I want to emphasize something important. What role does Rich play in the community? While he made some interesting videos, his main achievement was being the first to do it in single player. The method they created was done on a server, Psycraft, I think, but it required at least 3 people. Some players even managed to replicate it, but you always needed to use 3 people for one of those chunk change or chunk swap moments and so on. But ElRichMC wanted to do this in his survival world, and for that he couldn't bring in other people because his survival has always been single player. In fact, his survival world was turning 10 years old. So he simply came up with a method to do this with just 1 player.
And in single player, you have an advantage, which is that you can press escape and the game pauses. I was able to take advantage of that to use a different method in survival mode. Think about it, many of the people who used this method before relied on several players, or even if you were a player and used the same method, you could do it with bots. That's the difference between the server and single player. Simply realizing that is what makes everything else click.
How other forbidden blocks are obtained besides bedrock, such as command or barrier blocks, just follows naturally. In the end, with Wordtearing, you can change the block IDs and you have a way to get them. So you just play around with the block IDs to swap them for others. And you can change them and make them solid, or even change them and directly get the item. And guys, that's the story of how ElRichMC got bedrock. And that's it. The video is over. You can go now, okay? It's over now. It's done. Still here? Let me tell you. This has been my channel's most ambitious video, requiring the most hours of work, research, talking to people, and editing. Many thanks to Miguel for his effort too. So if you've been able to enjoy the whole video up to this point, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like. Tell me what you thought, what it made you feel in the comments, or simply share it with your friends. If you want to watch my hardest video after this, it's about making a calculator with Threadstone. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.